It's Apple versus Epic, but does anyone have the moral high ground here?
And why is Google using scare tactics in its war of words with the Australian government?
Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support. Hey there, welcome back to Vertical Hold Behind the Tech News, the weekly podcast where we sneak over state borders to catch up with Australia's leading technology journalists to get the stories behind the tech news of the week. I'm Adam Turner, and I'm joined, as always, by Alex Kidman, a tech hoarder like myself who also took the plunge this week and cleared his office of decades-old tech. Alex, what treasures did you uncover?
Look, I don't know that treasure is the right word here. I'm kind of torn between, the Flip video camera, remember those?
Oh, yeah.
Or the 8 meg USB flash drive, which will only install if you have a floppy with its driver on it.
Oh, that's going straight to the pool room. That is gold. Don't put that on eBay.
I have no idea what's on it because I can't find the driver.
We're also joined once again by Finder Editor-in-Chief Angus Kidman. Gus, you've also been working your way through your CD collection and all the other treasure troves in your office. What gold have you uncovered?
Well, I think the weirdest thing I've listened to is an album by a band you've never heard of called Rump, called Hating Brenda, and it's just eight separate individual songs about how terrible Brenda from 90210 is, and that really speaks to my 90s soul.
Why am I not surprised that you own that?
This week, Google's gone on a serious PR offensive in an effort to get the federal government to back down on its proposed media revenue rules. And we'll delve into this shortly. But first, late last week, Epic Games dropped the bombshell with Fortnite. And it wasn't a new season of the game either. Alex, what's the story here?
Yeah, so late last week, if you're a Fortnite player on a mobile device, so on an iPhone or an Android device, you would have noticed that the way that you buy in-game currency had changed a little bit. You could still buy it through Google or through Apple, or you could buy it direct from Epic itself, much, much cheaper, which is, of course, what most people would have wanted to do if they're big Fortnite fans. But Apple and Google were not fans of this because their terms and conditions basically say if you've got any in-app purchase, any kind of financial dealing within an app on a mobile device, they want their 30% cut, and you're not allowed to circumvent that, which is why things like, for example, the Kindle app for iOS originally actually did do purchases within the app and then switched to no, you can just access your library from within the app. There's no finance taking place here.
If you want to buy the book, you go and buy it through another method and then come back and read it.
And then you can load it onto an iPhone or an iPad. Yeah. But Epic said, this is what we're doing. And almost immediately, Apple and Google went, right, well, you're out the door. And as it turned out, Epic was super prepared for this. This wasn't just let's see if we can get away with this kind of story, because they launched a joint legal offensive and a PR offensive. And the centerpiece of their PR offensive, for those who might not have seen it, was an ad which itself was a riff on Apple's fairly iconic 1984 ad talking about how Fortnite had to be freed from the shackles of App Store tyranny. Gus, do you think they've got a point?
Yeah, I do. I think they're highlighting an issue that's come up repeatedly over the years about whether this model that Apple and Google have in place is fair. Like whether it's reasonable for them to say, right, if you want to use our App Store, we have to be able to take a clip of the ticket and that you're not really supposed to promote any other alternative ways of doing it. Whether they've got a chance of actually winning this, whether their pockets are deep enough to stick out that battle's a different question. But I do think it's a question that's come up a lot of the time, and maybe because Fortnite is a big cash generating thing, it has a dedicated audience, maybe they are the brand to kind of take the battle on. But of course, the battle's become a lot more complicated. It's not just about that now. We've actually seen the switch in terms of Apple's next round of retaliation.
Well, this is true. So from Fortnite kind of being kicked off and lawsuits and countersuits being bounced around, Apple has now said that they're also going to restrict Epic Games' ability to access Mac developer tools for its Unreal Engine. And Unreal Engine is the game engine that runs, in fact, an awful lot of game software. This is not just Fortnite anymore. And Epic has, not unfairly in that instance, I think, said, well, look, hang on, Unreal Engine doesn't have anything to do with this. So, of course, yet another countersuit is brewing there. But you're right about them having deep pockets. An analysis I was reading suggested that Apple, within a month, was making about $13 million from its cut of Fortnite revenue, which, of course, means that Epic is making the other 70%.
Yeah.
This is a lot of money. And this is a big, this is a millionaires having a money fight in a way.
Yeah, it is millionaires having a money fight, but these the millionaires are the only ones who have got a chance of even slightly working their way around it. Because if you're a really big brand, you can get through that reader clause, which is what Kindle uses, it's what Netflix uses. But yeah, it's hard luck. But Apple says, oh, we need this revenue because we run the App Store, we police everything that all goes in there. I refuse to believe it's costing them anything as much as that. For them, it's a big profit center. It's the second fastest growing part of Apple's profits overall. So there is this question, and for me, the question is it's not just whether they should be able to say it's our store. It's the fact that they really don't want you to go and play with other stores. It's the equivalent of saying you can't sell through anybody else and you can't promote alternative ways of doing it. Competition authorities don't like that. And the European Union, always the leader on this stuff, has already started looking into Apple's behavior here. So this is very much fuel to that fire, I think.
But this has been a fight that's been brewing for a long time, and we had to wait for someone with the clout of Fortnite to actually drop this bomb. But it's not the first time. Apple says it has these rules that it applies to everybody. Everybody pays, I think, a 30% cut if you do some kind of transaction through the app. And if it's a 2-year subscription or some long-term deal, they might do you a special deal and let you do it for 15%. Same rules for everybody, except no. Because when Tim Cook got pulled before the antitrust hearings in the US earlier this year, it came out that they did a deal with Amazon Prime Video and gave them a better price because Amazon was big enough to throw its weight around, and Apple and Amazon were sort of trying to bury the hatchet. They'd been fighting for a long time about, well, we won't put you on our device and we won't put you here. And so they struck a deal. So Apple can strike deals when it wants to, and that's what it comes to the heart of, is they're not being fair. And they do these deals for some of the really big streaming entertainment providers. And Epic's saying, well, how big do you have to be, man? We want a seat at the table with the grown-ups. If you're going to do those kind of deals for your massive streaming services, well, we deserve the same kind of treatment.
Well, except it's not just that, Adam. Epic's actually said they're not just going into this fight for themselves. This is not something where they're looking, or at least this is what they're saying publicly, of course, that this is not something where they're looking to just settle with Apple for a better Fortnite deal. They want to see a bit more opening up of this market for all developers,
Everybody.
Which is an interesting one. There is also the point, though, of course, it wasn't just Apple that kicked Fortnite out. Google did as well. The big difference there, of course, being that on an Android device, you can still sideload Fortnite onto your device. You can presumably update it if further updates come down the pike, whereas if you've got an iOS device which has Fortnite, it should run okay right now, but future updates either to Fortnite or to iOS could absolutely kill it dead.
Fortnite's been encouraging people to sideload. Epic's been encouraging people to sideload Fortnite for a while. I remember we talking about this security nightmare, I don't know, a year ago or so. What's changed now? Because why did Epic ask people to sideload Fortnite before, and why has now Google decided to kick them out?
Because they didn't want to be on those app stores in the first place, because they didn't want to share the revenue, presumably. So you're right. Look, when it first appeared on mobile, to the best of my recollection, it was a sideload-only option. If I recall correctly, I think Samsung had it first on last year's Notes, like the Note 10 series, and then it was coming through to other devices on the Android side. And of course, you can't sideload it all on iOS, which is the other big challenge point there.
I guess these kind of deals go back to the early days of iPhones and the app stores. And Gus, back then, the idea of in-app purchases and freemium models where you constantly handed over money didn't really exist, did it? So it wouldn't have even occurred to Apple that they were going to make this kind of money out of these kind of deals.
Well, it certainly wasn't the public way that Apple was presenting that story. They were very much, we'd like some stuff in here. The Apple line at that time was very tied into, we actually don't make any money out of the free apps. Like, that literally costs us money to host them. even then, it wasn't particularly credible because the iPhone was very profitable very quickly. So it is reflective of an even longer standing pattern of Apple likes doing this tight control of its developer universe, and it always has. I can remember the very first in-depth investigative story I ever wrote in tech journalism in 1994 was about how Apple was trying to exert control over its Sydney developer group by saying, we won't give you the developer group discounts if you don't stop pointing out the flaws in our products. They have got a long history of doing this kind of stuff.
But, I mean, and to take a slight devil's advocate position, Apple's position here is that control keeps the App Store safe. And certainly we've not seen the level of kind of malware and to the same extent kind of fake apps or duplicate apps on the App Store as we've seen on Google Play. And again, all of that kind of oversight technically does have a cost associated with it. Whether 30% is still fair is kind of up in the air. But I guess the other point with this is that this is not something that is going to resolve quickly. If Epic is determined to stick its heels in and say, no, we want a deal that's not just us, but everyone, we want this more open, that will drag through the courts for years, won't it?
It will, and they need a slightly more urgent resolution. The court system is bad at this, and this is probably something we'll keep touching on through the episode. It's hard to deal with tech, but yeah, it's gonna be messy challenge. I think it's interesting that as it extends into the Unreal Engine, as you said, that messes things up. Apparently, a lot of Apple Arcade software actually relies on using that, so Apple is shooting itself in the foot a bit as well. It's the stakes are quite high.
So, Alex, speaking of battling behemoths, Google's come out swinging hard this week in its war with the ACCC, but it's running a bit of a scare campaign, which is not really what you'd expect, is it?
No, look, it's not. And I think almost anyone operating out of an Australian IP address who uses Google services, and that's roughly speaking all of us, has probably seen this pop up on Google searches or on YouTube, a little pop-up window saying that the way Aussies search every day on Google is at risk from new government regulation. And if you click on the little Learn More button, it takes you to this open letter that they've penned. And they're going on a bit of a kind of PR and marketing offensive against the new media regulations which are set to come in, which would oblige them to revenue share or pay. There's a negotiated model which still has to be settled with large media entities. Now, Google's going a fair bit further than that. They're talking about things like having to share personal user data or Australians having to pay for use of Google's services. Gus, what's Google's game here?
Google's game here is that it wants to get an early salvo into the PR battle, and it wants to go for the things that it thinks the average user will care for. Because the proposed regulations, and they are proposed regulations, and they have to be negotiated, there's so much unclear detail. This is stuff that most people don't care about. The average consumer isn't going to care about that. They just want to click around thing. And most of them aren't going to care about Google saying it's a warning. They're going to click away the way they click away from every other security warning or any other type of warning they send in their lives. But the people who do pay attention to it, they want them to think, oh, if you let these things change, you'll stop getting all this good stuff. They're just trying to get this is about a hearts and minds part of the battle. It's not they'll continue doing all their normal lobbying and trying to do stuff behind the scenes. But I think they're trying to put a stake in the sand early because they're worried about setting a precedent. There've been similar debates in other countries. The one that is talked about constantly is Spain, where there were attempts at similar regulations, and there were some fairly drastic responses from Google there. So what Google doesn't want is any kind of precedent that says it can't go and freely scrape and freely represent stuff, because that is the underpinning of how it brings in an audience. So right up front, it just wants to get in and get people going, oh, hang on. And it's really trying to stir a bit of that stuff of saying, oh, well, why would we want, government regulation getting in the way of a free and open internet? It's really just trying to insert that little bit of doubt. Well, that's my take on really what it's going for with this stage of what's going to be a very long, and drawn out discussion potentially.
But the way they've phrased it is with a sprinkling of, I think the technical term is bullshit. They're saying things that clearly aren't true. They're saying things like, YouTube content creators could receive fewer views and earn less under the code, things that just do not line up at all. Why are they? I think they're just shooting themselves in the foot. This is not how you win over the Australian public. It's not like maybe even the US, they go for negative campaigning and they love that kind of thing. Not here. This is how you put Australians offside.
I was Mr. Rabbit as a counterexample to whether or not that can work in Australia, but...
yeah.
And look, I think the other thing is some of what Google is putting out there, and I think the ACCC has actually come out with a response to the open letter with words to this effect. Some of what Google's putting out there is not necessarily untrue in a future-speaking sense, but it's stuff that Google would largely choose to do if it went down that path. I think there are some things that Google's talking about, though, that give me pause for thought in terms of the way that Australian media models work, because my understanding of this regulation, and Gus, please correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding of this regulation is that it's to do with the large media entities, so your Nines and your News Limiteds and so on, getting specific access and specific payment. You've got to be a certain size publisher.
Well, yeah, you have to have a certain volume. There's this very specific provision that says that smaller publishers can band together. So the idea is that you could go in as a group of 70 community newspapers and say, well, we're negotiating at that scale. That sounds nice in theory. In practice, there are very few of those community newspapers around, and the ones that exist are owned by News or by Nine, what was formerly Fairfax. So I'm not sure how much that actually kicks in. One of the things is it's not at all, the idea is that they've got to come to some sort of deal where they agree what is the value of traffic showing up on Google as opposed to everywhere else. Like, there has to be a discussion. The discussion hasn't even started. And what Google is saying is, we don't think we should have to have the discussion.
Let me play devil's advocate here and ask a question that I'm sure a lot of people would be wondering. How does Google make money off media content? Because if I write an article for The Age and it appears on The Age website and then gets picked up by Google and run on Google News or turn up in search results, Google don't display the whole article. Someone can't read that without coming to The Age's website. They drive traffic to The Age where The Age can sell ads alongside that traffic. So at first glance like that, how is it hurting? If anything, Google picking up a story should be helping the publishers. How is it hurting them?
It is more complicated than that. I mean, because I do think there's a glimmer of truth in what the thing is that Google can actually take the eyeballs away from you, because a lot of Google's strategies now is not just about delivering search results. It's about delivering enough information that you feel like the question's being answered and you never actually get to the story.
So you get a snippet of a story which tells you basically what you want to know.
Yeah, it's very hard to put a monetary value on that, and that's what's hard. But I don't think it can be denied that changed things. It's also clear, as a news organization, sometimes you end up being, in order to show up in searches, because news organizations want to show up in searches, you sometimes have to cleave closer to Google's regulations. So Google has a format called AMP, which it wants sites that do news to use. It's got a big consumer benefit. The pages load quicker. The big disadvantage to a publisher is that means you have to take out some of the things on that page that might actually make you money. That's the genuine concern that is there. So I think I can see that there's a gap there that's messy. On the other hand, turning devil's advocate in the other direction, one of the things that I think actually the ACCC regulations are insane, I don't see how they think this would work, is they have this requirement that news organizations should be told 28 days in advance of any changes to the algorithm that are going to affect how they might appear in results, and which displays such a misunderstanding of how the Google algorithm works. Google doesn't know in 28 days in advance how it works.
Yeah. And if they did, they wouldn't tell us. That's how people game the system. They deliberately don't tell, but that's just laughable.
But I was actually going to raise this, and I agree that the 28-day provision is a bit wacky. But again, looking at that broader media landscape, how much of a concern is it that a larger of-scale media player, because I think we do agree that the smaller ones are not likely to band together, that they're going to have effectively an SEO advantage, or might get an SEO advantage by Google saying, these are the things we're looking for, this is the stuff you've got to do. And doesn't that entrench them, in fact, in a much, much more beneficial position? I mean, this is Google's argument that they shouldn't have to do this. But isn't that bad for general discoverability of news, and especially for smaller media players?
I mean, the reality is the way that Google works with news content now, it has a heavy bias towards big, large, well-known, reputable players. That is already the case, and it's been very evident. And I've spent a lot of time in the last 3 or 4 years knee-deep in how this stuff works. It is very evident that if you are one of the handful of big media players in Australia, which effectively comes down to being the two main newspaper publishers, plus the ABC, plus the main TV networks, your results are much more likely to show up in terms of news results anyway, and that's both within Google News itself and also in news stories that show up within other search results. That bias is already in there, and it is interesting that you've got this argument coming from major media players saying, "Oh, we think this is problematic," at a point when they've already actually got a bit of an advantage. So the dynamics of this are sometimes quite hard to work out.
It seems to me that part of this is just about the fact that the media is upset that all the advertising money that used to go to it now goes to online entities like Google and Facebook. And I can understand that they're unhappy about that. But so their answer is, you took away our advertising money, so now we just want you to give us some money back. But the two don't quite line up. To me, it's kind of like the horse and cart industry going to Ford and saying, people don't take horses and carts anymore, so you owe us money. It's like, well, no, the model changed. And in the media's case, it's even worse because they committed the original sin. They put it all on there for free. They gave it away. So they created this problem for themselves, and they're still trying to struggle on how to fix it. But it's not Google's fault.
No, and it's genuinely, it's a tricky one. It's interesting. The fact that this regulation came in, we had a lot of discussion about it suddenly came in. It's not disconnected to the fact that we really have reached the tipping point where you're just seeing news organizations shrink, and COVID has put the final nail in that coffin because a lot of those the handful of small regional players who were working okay, a lot of them have just spent the last 3 months suspending things. So it feels like there's an urgency there, but you could certainly make a case that obviously having functioning news is valuable for society in a way that's not necessarily going to be rewarded by the free market. But arguably the way that you have to solve that is you have to pump more money into the ABC in the Australian context. And clearly that's not something that's been pursued actively by current governments in Australia.
Well, I was going to say, because the code itself doesn't actually include the ABC or SBS.
Deliberately screws them. The ones who need the money the most, the ones who the government are denying funds to, are now denying them the opportunity to make funds somewhere else. It's disgraceful.
But it's the clash because, of course, there's a political balancing act there in terms of trying to, on the one hand, say, look, we want to support these. On the other hand, there's a constant and there's a ferocious battle waged in many sections of the commercial media about that the ABC shouldn't be there at all. And this is not an Australia exclusive problem. You see exactly the same argument happening in the UK, across mainland Europe. So it's very hard to see how this code ultimately will solve anything. But also, until they get to the point of negotiations, we won't know. And all the current standoffs mean it's going to take a long while before we get to that. And how it's ever going to be enforced is really, really, really up in the air. I understand the problem they're trying to solve, but I just don't think as a solution it makes a lot of sense.
So one of the things that Google has flagged, and the ACCC has said, look, if Google does this, Google does it, is this idea of paying for Google services. Now, leaving aside the fact that they've already burnt the Google Plus name, so they couldn't possibly call subscription Google that, do you think they've got a big enough model? If Google decided to say, no, we hate this, Australians, you're going to have to pay for our stuff, are they big enough now that people would, do you think?
No.
Not more
like
than
to
they
pay
do
for
now.
stuff.
You can pay. I mean, you can pay. So you can pay now. You can choose if you choose to pay for YouTube Premium. If you decide I don't want to watch ads on YouTube, you can pay for
or
that.
Google One, or
yeah. If you decide you want to pay for a bit of extra storage because you can't be bothered cleaning out your Gmail, I am certainly guilty of that. Then you will do that. But everything that we know from a long history of how any of these kind of free versus paid services work is that a tiny percentage of people will do the paid thing. It's probably not going to be the basis of your whole business in that case. I mean, whether Google would go, oh, Australia, you just look too hard, and we'd all have to go back to using Bing, I don't know.
Is Ask Jeeves still out there?
I don't know. Do you remember Answers?
Oh, yeah.
I was an Alta Vista man myself back in the day.
I think that's pre-Google Answers, actually.
So the other thing is these media regulations are also applicable to Facebook. Facebook is the other area that they've said, these rules are going to apply. Have we heard much from Facebook on their reaction to it?
No, they haven't dived in there yet. I'm sure they're going to. I think the big complication with the massive difference is that with Google, it's all about where are they appearing in the results. So much of how you work on Facebook comes down to how people share stuff, and is how that's prioritized is under Facebook's control. But I think it will be a different debate with the way that Facebook works, and because there's even less obvious connection to how is the adjacency of Facebook ads related to whether people go through the article. Again, it's because in some cases people just see the headline and what gets shared, and they sit there and they argue about it. But they were probably going to do that anyway.
But you can't stop people sharing articles on Facebook. What do you want Facebook to do? Scan through links and go, no, that's a link to The Age. We're not going to let you post it.
Well, they obviously have that capacity because they do it for
Well, they
a
have it,
handful
but
of
will
things
they
that they're
do it?
supposed to block. It's actually criminally easy to do that sort of stuff. The other area where this gets swampy is let's suppose they say, right, well, we're not dealing with these organisations because they're messy. Where does that leave anyone who operates in the way that the Daily Mail operates, which is to essentially re-report everything that everybody else has said, so you don't need to go anywhere else?
Re-report is a very generous term.
All right, so copy.
And
is what I'm trying to say,
Vertical
but,
Hold legal team appreciates your efforts.
We certainly do. We certainly do. No phantom hackers here.
But yeah, there's a whack-a-mole element to the whole discussion that around whether you can actually control this stuff. I don't think the Google response makes a lot of sense, but I don't think the ACCC proposal makes a lot of sense. And as such, there's going to be a lot more arguments and flogging each other with wet letters before any of this gets resolved.
Well, that just about wraps up another episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to Gus for joining us for this week's show.
It's always been a thrill, and I'll bring more letters next time.
Now, presuming people don't assume that you're actually me, where can people find your work and your good self online?
Oh, well, they can find my work at finder.com.au, and they can find me on Twitter at GusWorldAU.
And, of course, you can catch up with us on Twitter at VerticalHoldAU, online at verticalhold.com.au, or via the Vertical Hold Facebook page.
And once again, thanks everyone for listening. We really appreciate you dropping by. Don't forget to tell your friends about us and leave us a review on your podcasting platform of choice to help new people find us. Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support.
Travel all over the countryside.
Ask the Kidman brothers.
Ask the Kidmans. I always thought that could have been a spin-off podcast.